Welcome to Disability News and Views, brought to you by the Mayor's Commission for Persons with Disabilities. I'm Krista McCosh, the Disability Commissioner and ADA Title II Coordinator for the City of Boston. In this episode, we have some updates about some exciting work that we're doing in City Hall, along with some great community events. Then my co-host, Ken Meyer, will be speaking with Laurie Block from the Disability History Museum.
3 weeks ago, we celebrated our nation's Independence Day, and today we're here to rejoice in and celebrate another Independence Day, one that is long overdue. And with today's signing of the landmark Americans for Disabilities Act, every man, woman, and child with a disability can now pass through once closed doors into a bright new era of equality, independence, and freedom.
This July marks the 27th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Mayor's Commission for Persons with Disabilities will be hosting our annual ADA Day celebration on Tuesday, July 25th, from 12 noon to 2 p.m. on City Hall Plaza. I'd like to invite everyone to join us for this year's celebration. Come out for a fun day of music, food, and friends, along with a resource fair of local disability organizations. You can find out more details about ADA Day on our Facebook page, by subscribing to our email newsletter, or by emailing our office at disability@boston.gov. We hope to see you there. The 4th of July is rapidly approaching. The Boston Pops Fireworks Spectacular is right around the corner. If you're planning to go to the Esplanade this year, there will be accessible viewing areas located on both sides of the Charles River, in Boston and in Cambridge. These are filled on a first-come, first-served basis. On the Boston side, the accessible viewing area is located within the hat shell to the right of the stage. On the Cambridge side, there's a reserved accessible seating area along the Cambridge Parkway. Accessible restrooms are available at all restroom locations throughout the event. For more information, go to bostonpopsjuly4th.org or email us at disability@boston.gov. Beginning this spring, my office will begin working on a new initiative, an Accessibility Priority Survey. We want to collect information from residents and visitors with disabilities to help us better understand the needs of people with disabilities in Boston. While we understand the major issues that impact our community, we would like to have a better idea of how our constituents would prioritize accessibility concerns. We welcome both residents and visitors to take part in the survey and help us set an accessibility agenda that reflects the goals of the disability community. You can learn more at boston.gov/disability or call our office at 617-635-3682. And finally, I would like to let our viewers know about the Boston Disability Commission Advisory Board, a group of 13 city residents with disabilities who advise Mayor Walsh and other city officials on important issues in the disability community. The advisory board meets on the fourth Monday of each month from 5:30 to 7:30 in City Hall. The public is welcome to attend meetings in person, participate by phone, or watch our meetings live on TV or online. The next meeting will be held on Monday, July 24th. You can visit boston.gov/disability for more information and a full schedule. That's the news, and now I'd like to turn my show over to Ken Meyer.
Thank you, Commissioner. And it's my pleasure to welcome Laurie Block. And Laurie, I've been to a lot of museums and a lot of halls of fame, but I've never heard about or been involved in a disability museum. Take a few minutes, tell us a little bit about your background and about the museum itself.
Well, first, the museum is actually virtual. No bricks, no mortar. It exists at www.disabilitymuseum.org. And it has a kind of slow start, slow history. It's been around for quite a while, but I belong to the generation of women who first learned about their child's disability before the child was born. And that exposed me fairly profoundly to such a wide range of attitudes and experiences that by the time my children were born, and as they grew up, I was constantly asking myself questions. Well, how did this come about? Or why did, this person say X? Or why did, people think that when my daughter was very little, people would actually periodically give her money, and they would ignore her sister. They would give my daughter, who used braces and crutches, money, and I would go, what is going on here? And I was a history documentary filmmaker and a film researcher, and so I began to produce work in film and in radio and on the web that used history to tell stories. But the first person who I was telling stories about disability history to was myself, because I needed to understand how all the services that I took advantage of came to be. And it was a way of paying a debt to the people that came before me who advocated in a different era.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about disability history. First of all, how far back can we trace the disability world, and what are some of the things that you found out as far as disability history that really surprised you?
Well, people with disabilities have always been a part of society, so there's always been a relationship between the general culture and people with disabilities. But some of it's rooted, it's ancient. It's an ancient experience. And I think maybe a good story is one of the first artist fellowships that I had that was specifically related to disability was with the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester. It is a very, very large collection of pre-1875, largely American history collection. And I went in and I began to, with the help of the reference librarian, look for disability records. And I couldn't find very much, this is already 25 years ago, I couldn't find very much under the word disability. And then I tried the word under handicapped, and I couldn't find very much under handicapped. But when I started to use really old language, I turned up dozens and dozens of records. And the most surprising records in that particular search that I uncovered were stories that were inside sort of chapbooks that were used in Sunday school at the beginning of the 19th century. In the 19th century, when the Protestant Sunday schools began to flourish as a way to teach virtue to the new republic's citizens, there was a separation between church and state. So now that the church was out of the public school system, how are we going to ensure the virtue of our citizens? They told all kinds of stories for children about how to prevent vice, how to be temperate. There are stories about abolition. There are stories about Native Americans. There's a very anti-Catholic element, but there are also many, many stories about disabled children. And they tell now it's often idealized. These are not specific children that we know. And they have titles like Happy Poverty, or Blind Ellen, or Poor Matt, the Clouded Intellect. And these stories describe the behavior of the able-bodied person towards the disabled person, and that involves, you have to be benevolent, you have to be kind and generous, even what we might call inclusive. And they also describe, whether or not that was what people did or not is a completely different thing. But they also have stories about the disabled child responding to the community. And the disabled child should never complain, learn to accept the will of God, and become useful. And in the effort to become useful, these books also describe really early schools for the blind and schools for the deaf. So, they're basically describing the Perkins School, which is founded in 1829, and the American School for the Deaf is founded in 1817 in Hartford, and I was very surprised. That was probably one of the most surprising discoveries I've ever made.
It's hard to believe that at one point in that era of the world, there were people that thought that those with disabilities should not be allowed to live.
Well, I think that you just can't even, you have to, in historical imagination really requires you to kind of put yourself in the position of people who don't have the same resources and the same tools that we have. One of the things, I live in rural Western Massachusetts, where there's, lots of old houses. And if you were living way out in the hills in a house that was not near anyone else's house, and your husband or your child got kicked in the head by a horse in a field, what are you going to do? It's a very difficult situation. So imagining the past is part of the work of history, and I think in imagining and trying to get into how and why people from different eras think the way they do helps actually create empathy for how much progress we actually have made in relationship to people with disabilities.
Why is it important for people in the 21st century to know about something that happened in the 1700s and 1800s? And what's the reaction of young people, students today that learn about it?
Well, an example I'll give is we often talk about the Civil War in terms of the very large amount of death. But there's also a huge volume of people who are wounded who survive. And when there's not a medical apparatus before the Civil War that is related to the Army, but it is created during the Civil War. And there are plans, they're divided between the Union Army has one set of plans, Confederate Army has another set of plans. But the civilians create, in something called the Sanitary Commission, they imagine an aftermath of the war and what are they going to do with disabled veterans. And they do create an entire pension program for disabled veterans where you have to document. It's a bureaucracy. It's in Washington. You have to document how you got wounded, what kind of medical care you received, if any. It is an income support system that is got a lot of corruption associated with it. It is extended to the families of young people, the families of the disabled veterans. And it functions like a pre-Social Security system, and it is the largest item in the federal budget by 1900. And the key that's really important and that really surprises young people and surprises teachers, we do a lot of professional development with how to introduce topics in disability history to grade 7 through 12 teachers, is that these benefits only went to Union Army disabled veterans and their families. If you were a disabled veteran of the Confederate Army, you had to appeal to your own individual state for help. And the economy of the Deep South in the late 19th century, early 20th century, was far less well-to-do than the North. And when the more 20th century progressive social welfare legislation begins to be argued, there's an enormous animosity towards the federal government in a large part of the country that if you don't know that history, it's just totally invisible, where some of that animosity and distrust originally came from.
Does knowing this information for teachers make them better at educating young people?
I would say yes. I think that when you begin to do professional development of teachers about how to include topics in disability history, you begin to introduce some basic notions about policy. You have to understand how regulations can really benefit and or harm people. You have to begin to understand what a grant and aid is, what an entitlement is, and how those three kinds of policies are different than civil rights. And they all have advantages and disadvantages. And that vocabulary, and it's more than vocabulary, understanding those concepts, I think, are part of what makes a democracy. You know, like if you don't have a citizenship that understands what these kinds of programs do, how they came about, what their limits are, then you can talk in very glib terms and get in quite a huge political battle of the kind that we find ourselves in today. And people don't know what programs deliver. An example, in 1900, they had a lot of new tools to do data mining, to find out all kinds of numbers about who, it was a Hollerith tabulator, about who you could survey who is blind, who is deaf, who had mental illness, who lived in an almshouse, what kind of, how did they get there? What kind of condition did they have? How educated were they? Where did they come from? And then activists, including disabled activists, in the early 20th century began to lobby for using that empirical evidence for programs that, for example, they discovered that most blind people acquire their blindness not during childhood, but as adults. And so they began to develop different kinds of training and employment programs for the blind. These happen piecemeal, but I think I'm wondering, but it becomes really important. There's no guarantee, and that those early programs that, social workers and blind individuals, for example, the Mass Commission for the Blind has three, in its very earliest conception, had three blind individuals, Helen Keller and two other people on the board. But there were no guarantees that when they began to encounter prejudice and discrimination, and even though they would do employment training, they didn't have any tools to fight that. And so until much later, they don't have any kind of ways to intervene with any kind of stigma and attitude about people with disabilities, even though they build a body of knowledge of how to train people.
All right, and now you have brought some video clips to share with us, I understand.
Well, one of the things that I think is, you hear a lot of people talk about around identity politics about, do you prefer, about the term, I prefer to call myself as a person with a disability. There's a whole huge language debate. I did something that, there's a tool on Google called an engram in which you can track how often words were used. And disability, although disability has been around a very, very long time, it doesn't become really commonly used until the 1970s is when it begins to come in, but 1980s is when, and early 90s is when it kind of takes over. Before that, from 1900 to 1975 about, the word handicap is much more commonly used. But those changing definitions there's a really great, the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund has a wonderful video about the Section 504. And when you hear everyone being interviewed from that period of time, you can see the language explode, because that's one of the first events where a cross-disability group is really actively lobbying for civil rights, not just a grant and aid.
All right, we've got about 4 minutes left.
Sure.
What can we show our audience in some of these video clips that you brought?
You see at 504 it was a small group of people, but they took over the federal health, education, and welfare buildings in San Francisco. They lobbied in front of the same offices in several other cities, and this little clip has I think this clip has just Judy Heumann speaking in it.
All right. My producer, David Palomares, says we've got it, and we're ready to go, so let's watch it.
Approximately 75 or more who are taking part in this sit-in. This makes this the largest sit-in in the nation currently going on concerning the disabled and the handicapped. In Washington, there are about 40 people sitting in the outer office of the HEW Secretary, Joe Califano, and there are about 7 people in New York.
98 people stayed overnight in the offices used by Regional HEW Director Joe Maldonado. The 50 who remain at this hour say they have no intention of leaving.
Judy Heumann.
There are people that want to stay here until, and there is a significant number of those people. Quite frankly, I think it's going to be very difficult for them to put a lot of pressure on them. When we asked them questions yesterday about 504, and we said to them, have you ever read 504? Every one of the people that we had in that office said no. I mean, I think that they should thank us for being here and welcome the opportunity that finally they're going to get educated about the law that they're supposed to be enforcing.
So
right.
504 is the precedent that lets the ADA flourish.
And if people want to get in touch with you or get involved in your museum, how can they do that?
Well, they can go directly to www.disabilitymuseum.org, or you can write info@disabilitymuseum.org, and that email comes to me.
Well, we will definitely have you back because of an individual that you and I have both spoken about and shared videos of, a lady that many people I'm sure here have heard of, named Helen Keller.
But the story I want to tell about Helen Keller is not the one that most people know. She grows up, and she is actually a early human rights pioneer.
And we will get into that in another broadcast. As Jimmy Carter used to say, trust me.
Okay.
We will do that.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us. It was an honor to have you here. And we will be back again with another edition of Disability News and Views.